It is my privilege to welcome the Reverend Dr. Geoffrey Cummins, who will be presenting his second public lecture in Tonga tonight. I talked with Dr. Cummins on Friday, and he specifically said he does not claim to be an expert in Tongan history, but he has done a lot of work in collating information about the history of Tonga. And he wishes that these lectures will provide a window for those who are interested in Tongan history to pursue further work on it. And I think most of you know that he was former principal of Tupou High School here at this very site. And there are former students of Dr. Cummins who are in this room. And I know that they and those of us who were not privileged enough to be students of his are very honored to have him speak to us today. So without further ado, I invite the Reverend Dr. Geoffrey Cummins to conduct his presentation this evening. My Lord, may I ask
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the introduction and for the opportunity to again stand on this ground and talk about history, which we did all those years ago. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. From the heading on the board and the dates that are mentioned there, you will see that this matches in really with the inaugural Tupou College lecture that we had the other night when we started in 1865 and went forward. So tonight we're looking at the origins of education. I've called it the making of schools, because there's another document I prepared which was called The Making of a Nation, and there's a further document as well with that kind of flavour to it. We're dealing this evening with what can only be called a revolution. A cultural revolution when the ancient Polynesian culture of the Friendly Islands came into contact with a strong influential culture from the other side of the world. An ancient oral tradition became a literate tradition. Language, learning and literature expressed orally for generations suddenly found expression through slates and alphabet cards and small manuscript books and printed books, and finally large volumes. A revolution. Does this sound a little dramatic, a little overstated, a bit exaggerated? Let me open a few windows this evening to look at a few key moments, a few key events in the story of the making of schools. And then at the end you can make a judgment for yourselves. The Wesleyan school system got off to a very difficult and complicated start in Tonga. Pioneer missionaries and their families, Reverend John and Mary Hutchinson and Reverend John and Sarah Thomas, had decided to make a base at Hihifo at the western tip of the island in Arta's domain, and that caused a degree of difficulty from the start. Thomas said that he had made it clear to Arta that they wanted to, quote, teach them to know and to fear the Lord and other good things, and that they wanted Arta's protection, and that they wanted to have the children of the area to teach. They believed that Latu had agreed to that proposal. Charles Tyndall, who had come out with Laurie in 1822, who had a good language understanding, was the interpreter, and Thomas expected that everything would go smoothly from there. Things didn't work out quite as easily as that, and we'll come back to it a little later. Almost immediately, some people came seeking instruction, but Thomas and Hutchinson were too busy putting up their flat pack, a prefabricated house, that they had brought with them from Sydney. Latu's son Moimoi was particularly keen to be instructed, and Thomas gave him an alphabet card and taught him some sounds. He returned the next day for more, and as Thomas says, he waited around in the yard all afternoon, expecting me to teach him again. But I had too many other things to do. A week later, another youth came to Thomas for help with reading and writing, asking in a little English that he knew, "Me like book, you teach me book." Again, Thomas had to report, "I did not have time to teach him." At this stage, there was interest shown, but no time. If we can have a picture of the house. That's why Thomas and Hutchinson were busy. They were putting that flat pack they had brought from Sydney, that and the other goods that they brought with them weighed 100 tonnes. Thomas and Hutchinson were busy putting that together. That's why they kept saying we had little time to teach. Although interest was shown at this stage, Thomas had studied Mariner. Lord Tungi has brought along his copies, very valuable. 1817-18 publication, Mariner, who lived here for a few years from 1805, went back to England and with John Martin produced the first major dictionary of the Tongan language. Amazing. This is Will Mariner's remembering of less than 4 years living here in Tonga. It's an amazing book. I'll put it back in the charge of Tonga because it is an extremely valuable book. And thank you for bringing it here tonight. On the way out from England to Sydney, John Thomas had an opportunity to study Mariner, and he had some help with that. A young Tongan lad that Laurie had taken back to Sydney in 1823 with him, and who had gone to England with Laurie, and had had some schooling there, was on board the ship with Thomas when Thomas was studying to try and get a grip of the language. He did say that Tana Mao, Watson Mao as he was later known, that Watson Mao was much more interested in talking with the crew than sitting with him studying the Tongan language. But Thomas was frustrated. "I am almost always busily employed and in general much tired at night." Work on the house. "Yet I seem to have done nothing. I am dissatisfied with myself. All we have done is nothing. We have yet learned only a few words of the language. We have no place for a school. We refuse to let any of the people come into our house, as we have not the time to teach them. Thomas and Hutchinson were certainly busy with manual work. Preparing to teach. Once in Tonga, Thomas set himself a routine for learning Tonga. He says, in a bit more detail than is on the board there, I select some striking part of the Word of God, sometimes a chapter, at others a parable. I then produce someone, we sit down together, and I endeavour to tell him what I have selected, line by line, in the native tongue. And he gives me correct expressions of what I need. This I write down first upon a slate. I read it over, and by questions ascertain whether or not he understands what I mean. Afterwards, I write this into a book, which I keep for that purpose, and on the Sabbath day, I read it to the people, making such additions as I am able, and enforcing the great duties of the Bible upon them. One wonders how accurate those readings on the Sabbath were, given that process. But Thomas himself felt happy enough with it. Despite Thomas's dedication to learning the language, and month after month working with Mariner's time, and that amazing vocabulary, that amazing dictionary that Mariner has put together with Dr. Martin, Thomas made a significant decision on the 26th of July 1826. This is a historic moment in the story of the making of schools, of the Wesleyan schools here in Tonga. From Thomas's journal and from his history we read, having so far completed the back skillion of our part of the house, so that's the picture you had before there, they built a shelter out the back. Having completed the back skillion of our part of the house, we began a school to teach reading and writing in English. We had the young chiefs and a number of children of this fort who seemed much pleased to be taught the English language. And as it was all we could do at the first, we thought it would be one means of our learning their language, which, as it was not written, we must try and learn of them. You may think it strange that Thomas started teaching in English. But there'd been a lot of interaction between Tongans and English-speaking people, dating from Captain Cook's 1777 time in Hutchinson, where he stayed several months and put together the first small vocabulary of the Tongan language. And then there was the London Missionary Society missionaries in the late 1790s. And then there were people like Connolly and Morgan and Ambler, escaped convicts from the penal settlement in Sydney. Mariner, already mentioned, and Higgins and Singleton and Brown, who were survivors of the Port-au-Prince, which was taken by the Tongans in 1805. Singleton, who helped Thomas at various times, had been in Tonga 21 years by the time that Thomas had arrived. So there was a substantial amount of Tongan English contact over a period of 20 or 30 years before Thomas arrived. Laurie, in 1822, he brought a schoolmaster, but they were unable to establish a mission, and the schoolmaster therefore did not actually have a school. Johnny Lange had been to Tahiti. Probably learned the Tahitian language there, because later, about the same time that John Thomas arrived, Lange and Pape Tafita from Tahiti arrived in Tonga. They were on their way to Fiji with the London Missionary Society, but they were detained here in Nuku'alofa, and they stayed. And they started a school, they opened a church. And so there were convicts and castaways and beachcombers and former missionaries and whalers and traders, all communicating with the Tongan people in English as best they could. And so Thomas felt the best way to start a school would be to start teaching in English. Arthur was not all that pleased, and I'll say something about that in a moment. But one of the Tongans who had gone to Sydney, perhaps on a whaler or one of the trading ships at the time, at the very time that Thomas was coming here, there's an account in the Sydney Gazette in which this Tongan adventurer was offered a silver coin. And he looked at it, and in his English that he knew, he said, "That no good, my country. No eat that, no shoot. Nobody care for it." And he gave the silver coin back. So there was quite a bit of English floating around here in Tonga when the pioneer Wesleyans arrived. In that context, it's not so surprising that Thomas began teaching in English, the first step in the making of a school. So despite Arthur's original agreement with Thomas, he soon became opposed to what Thomas was doing. He discouraged those who came to Thomas and Hutchinson wanting instruction, and his attitude was, to quote Thomas, "It is good for us to worship English fashion, but it is not good for them. They want to worship Tongan fashion. As Arthur put it, our God is best for us. Your God is best for you." The breakthrough in the story of the making of schools really happens with the arrival of some reinforcement missionaries in 1827. Nathaniel Turner, who'd been working with the Maori people in New Zealand, and William Cross. And with the two Tahitians and some Lange, the chapel had been built, worship was being conducted, and the moment that Turner arrived, he said to Thomas, the very first Sunday he was there, "I'm going to Nuku'alofa to see what's happening there." And we read from Turner's reminiscences, it was their first Sabbath, and they started at daybreak. The morning service had begun when we arrived. It was conducted by one of the Tahitian teachers. He appeared an earnest and good man, and the people listened attentively. There must have been enough of the Tahitian and the Tongan language for allowing them to understand a little of what was being said. The chief was among the hearers, and the missionaries afterwards learned that about 240 people had begun to worship, had begun to Latu, though there were not so many present when Turner was there. And the service was over. Tupou, Tupou, offered refreshments for the visitors. And as Turner says, there was an English sailor there who was available as an interpreter. Turner was amazed at what he saw there. As he put it, language cannot express what were the feelings of my soul. Nothing I have ever seen of the kind ever gave me so much satisfaction. And within a few days, Turner decided to take up residence in Nuku'alofa with the Tahitians. This was another key moment in the making of the schools. At Nuku'alofa, the policy from the beginning with Turner, I suppose because of his Maori language background, was to teach both children and adults to read their own language. Rapid progress was made at Nuku'alofa, and within 6 months the school roll numbered 150, and several pupils had made enough progress to allow them to be employed as teachers. One of them was Peter D. As Turner said, they were employed as teachers as they were able to spell words of 5 or 6 syllables, to read the written hymns, they were handwritten at that stage. They could read the prayers and lessons from the scripture. The press had not yet arrived at this stage, so they were reading off pieces of paper and off slates. Increasing numbers led to the structuring of the schools by Turner into a male class, which he said met at daybreak before the men went off to work in their gardens, and a female class which met at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when their tapa meeting for the female members of the class for the day was over. The student teachers were tutored each day in order to keep them, as Turner said, in advance of their classes. At this stage, a regular orthography was established, and a 24-page reader was prepared and sent to Sydney for printing. 1828, sent off to Sydney and printed. As you can see, the orthography is not yet properly developed. Some of the words look a little different the way they are now. But 1828, the first school book. Even with the advent of a printed book, Turner began a lending library. They wrote out small sections of the scripture, bound them together on paper and distributed them. And the creation of schools, of course, was something that demanded more literature, and to begin with, before the press arrived, small manuscript books formed that lending library. Very soon schools were set up around Nuku'alofa, at Havelu, at Whanga, at Wafor, and at Hapai and Vavaka. The power of the written and printed word began to make its impact when Taufa Hau made a request for a teacher. a request for a missionary, in fact, to come to Hutchinson and help to teach him and his people. This was one of the key moments in the making of schools. Tupou had come down to Nuku'alofa to see the schools there and was convinced that that was what was needed in Hutchinson and Latu. Thomas was preparing to leave Hihifo. Things had gone poorly there, but he couldn't leave immediately, and so Peter V was one of the Nuku'alofa students who was more advanced in reading and writing, was sent to Hutchinson to fill in until Thomas could arrive. By the time Thomas arrived, a few months later, Tupou and many of his people could read and write. And Peter Turner, another missionary who had arrived, remarked, "Look at this little group. Peter V in the centre. The king and a few others surrounded him. And he reads a lesson, then points out one by one the letters of the alphabet from that card we saw a little while ago. He repeated them and they followed him until they could distinguish and point out some letters. All the pupils could not get close enough to see the manuscript lesson book. Those who could quickly learned the letters, and a few of them would get together and sing them until they became familiar with them. The singing of lessons, the singing of the alphabet, the singing of arithmetic became a feature of the early schools. Thomas organised the Hutchinson schools on the same basis that Nuku'alofa, male classes and female classes, all ages attended, with adults being the more numerous. The daily program involved sounding the letters of the alphabet, reading and answering questions from the catechism, and school commenced with singing and prayer. Thomas also followed Turner's example at Nuku'alofa and established a lending library of little manuscript books. 3 times a week, he said, the little manuscript books were recalled and reallocated, up to 20 changing hands at each session. Not only did borrowers lend them to friends, but those who could transcribe copies for themselves. The love of books, of the written word, part of what I think was a revolution coming out of an ancient Polynesian culture and suddenly coming face to face with a written culture. And the Tongans loved it. The arrival of a printing press at Nuku'alofa in 1831 was another key event that heralded major change. With mass production of textbooks, schools were established away from the mission headquarters. In June 1832, for example, there were Tongan teachers at 5 islands in the Hutchinson group, apart from Mifuka, where the king was in residence. As Turner explained to the committee in London, these teachers receiving nothing from us but books, written and printed, and necessary instructions, they go to instruct their fellow countrymen in the lessons of salvation and also to read and write. Turner felt that even if the only qualifications of a teacher were that they could, quote, read the Word of God correctly, can sing a little, and can pray, it was still a correct policy to, quote, send them out in charge of schools. But those Tongan teachers did a great job. Like their missionary tutors, these Tongan teachers, what they lacked in education and training, they made up for in enthusiasm. The result was that by adding 34 in Ha'apai, there were 234 teachers conducting lessons on 11 islands and providing regular instruction for almost 2,000 people. Similar results were reported from Vava'o and a lesser extent at Hihifo and Tongatapu. And it was Tongan teachers like Peter V. in Ha'apai who led the movement and created something of what I believe was an educational revolution. At Hihifo, where a Tongan teacher had been left with a few books, expecting to hold on until help came, a missionary or someone else to help, an emotional incident took place one day at the landing place. Because no help was forthcoming, after months, and after he had written several letters requesting help, Samuel, as the teacher was named, got into a canoe with the intention of making a personal appeal for help to the missionaries down south. When the people saw him get into the canoe, they were troubled and upset. They ran forward and crowded into the boat so that it was in danger of sinking. "What are you doing?" he asked. "You are going," they said. "You are our only teacher, and we will go too. For who will teach us when you are gone? Will the trees preach to us? Will the house in which we learn instruct us?" The teacher got out of the boat and joined his beloved people and went back to continue his teaching. Schools began to create a literate people. The Hihifo teacher had written letters down south to the missionaries, but to no effect. Taufa Ahau wrote letters. The potential of the written word and the power of the printed word and the effect of teaching the word were being seen throughout the Tonga Islands. In January 43, Taufa Ahau wrote to the Wesleyan Missionary Committee in London, urging that Tongan teachers be allowed to return to Samoa. They'd been brought out of Samoa because the London Missionary Society and the Wesleyans had made an agreement. Samoa was London Missionary Society, Tonga was Wesleyan. But the king and the Tongan people had a very long association, culturally, historically, genealogically, with the Samoan people. And the king wrote a very long letter to the mission house in London, arguing the case. That letter runs to 5 printed pages in a book, in a printed book, where he argues point after point as to why the Tongans should go back into Samoa and why the committee in England should withdraw, should untie the command that they had sent for Tongans to leave. There's part of the letter, written from the Naiafu on July the 4th, 1844. That day had been the big annual missionary meeting. The king was in the chair. Thousands of people were there. The amount of pigs and yams and so on, it's astounding. And I think at the end of that day, when the Tongans spoke about evangelism in the Pacific, when they were having their big missionary meeting, I think that night he sat down. That was the day of the meeting. I think he sat down and penned that letter to Mr. Tucker. Tucker and Mrs. Tucker had been his teachers in Hutchinson. Mrs. Tucker used to sit with him and work through his sermons as he prepared for the Sunday service. And Tucker had obviously written and had said in his letter, "Do you still remember us?" And the king says, "Mr. Tucker, how can I forget my hands?" An educational revolution, really. I mean, look how neatly that. I can't see any lines on that paper. Beautifully written letter, 2.5 pages of it. Show his signature if you wouldn't mind. Oh, there it is. Sorry. There's his signature, 1844. And that letter comes just a few months after he wrote that huge epistle to the mission board in London saying, "We need to go back to Samoa." It's a wonderful letter. Unfortunately, I don't know where the original is, but Mr. Thomas translated it, and there are certain phrases in the English translation which are obviously direct translation of of Tongan expressions, because they don't read as smoothly in English as perhaps they should, but they're very expressive. A wonderful letter. The Mission Printing Press and Printers. An Albion printing press arrived in Tonga from England in mid-1831, and this was another key event. Printer William Wood said that the people came from everywhere to see this amazing piece of equipment that he called the mighty engine. People gathered around to see the magic of the printed word coming off on paper. John Williams, the great LMS missionary, was very interested in Tonga still, although they had no missionaries here at the time. But he wrote in Missionary Enterprises, his book about the Pacific, and he described that between 1831 and November 1832, just a few months, 29,000 copies of small books had been printed. 29,000. They contained 5,772 pages, and each had been struck off the press and made available to the Tongan people. The press was a revolutionary moment in the story of the schools in Tonga. If those books still survive, then my brother Colin and I have quite a collection of Dr. Moulton's publications, but if some of these early publications existed, the 1831 hymn book is in the National Library, in the State Library of New South Wales. The 1838 hymn book is in the University of Auckland collection. But they're probably the only 2 copies of those books that have survived. Let me say something about the impact of the book on the Tongan people who came as children, as young people, as adults, as young adults, as old adults. Although when Thomas asked Arthur to come and learn at the school, he said Arthur held out his hands shaking and said he was too old. When an assignment of New Testaments arrived in Hutchinson on one occasion, the demand for those books was phenomenal. People wanted to pay in advance. They heard there was a ship coming with books. And there is this account of an old man who came to the missionary there in Hutchinson, and this is what it says. A poor man waited upon the missionary there at the mission house, bringing the price of a copy of a New Testament, bringing the price in coconut oil. The day was exceedingly wet and stormy, and the poor fellow looked cold and half drowned after his walk of several miles. He was remonstrated with for coming out in such weather. His reply, holding up his New Testament, but I have the word of life. There was a young man, the fire at the teacher's house. Teacher's house was burnt down. He was reporting it to the missionary, and the missionary was trying to console him on the great loss of his property. And his response, held up his New Testament, and he said, all my worldly goods are gone, but thank God I have saved my Bible. That's recorded in the And the young woman from Weber, very ill. She knew the time was coming when she would die. But she kept her New Testament, and of course the New Testaments were the basic reading material of the schools. She kept the reading the New Testament close to her, said she had profited from it so greatly through her life, and she instructed her friends and relatives around her that when she died, it was to be placed at her head in the grave. Well, she died, and her friends were going to comply with her wishes. But the teacher intervened, and he said words to the effect of, this is too precious a bury. Let us keep it for the living. And they did. The religious revival of 1834 was another key event in the history of the making of the schools, because initially it had a tremendously disrupting impact upon the schools. The missionaries, particularly Peter Turner had preached revival, and yet it wasn't the European minister preaching revival that led to the outpouring of what they call the outpouring of love on the people. It was a Tongan lay preacher, Tungi, who during his preaching, an amazingly strong feeling of the presence of God descended on those people, and a great Pentecostal type revival swept through the islands during 1834 and 1835. It brought schools to a conclusion. Everybody was singing and praying. As Turner points out on one occasion, the people called it dying with love. And his description of the chapel at Filator, where he had been summoned by a teacher who didn't know what to do, Turner says this: "The chapel was still full, crying for mercy. About 200 were lying on the floor as dead persons, who swooned away by the complete exhaustion of body and the overwhelming manifestation of saving power. We were quite astonished and stood in speechless awe before God. It was wonderful and far surpassed all I had ever seen or read of." But once the emotional part of the revival of 1834-35 began to subside a little, the impact on the schools then was momentous. People craved for learning. There was a new desire to learn to read and write. Examination days were also introduced about that time. They were great celebrations, and at one katoanga, as they were calling them at that time, the festivities that followed an examination day in Vavapu involved a very interesting feast. As Turner described in his journal, the feast consisted of 700 pigs and other things in abundance. 700 pigs and other things in abundance were consumed on that day. A cynic suggested that people were attending these schools so that when examination day came, there was a great katoanga. Festivals associated with schools. Don't we know something about that? Journalism and world. Okay. Tonight I'm just opening a few little windows and saying, look, have a look through there, see what's there, have a look through there. I'm not writing a whole history of education, but there's one thing that is very, very important, because it had far-reaching effects, and the effects of it are still felt today, as many of these other things are. The Reverend John Waterhouse, who was the General Superintendent of the South Seas Missions in Sydney, in 1841 made a visit to Tonga. He reported on a lot of things. He examined the schools. He suggested a reorganisation of classes. He suggested that the schools ought to have desks, which was a radical suggestion at that point. But more importantly, he suggested that a teacher training institute should be established. Before that, those who had a little ability to read and write, and who had love in their hearts and enthusiasm, they could be appointed as teachers. And those skills, of course, are still needed. The ability with literature, the warmth of the heart, and the desire to be enthusiastic are still needed, of course. But Waterhouse said you need teacher training, and so there was to be established an organisation known as the Friendly Islands Wesleyan Academy for the Training of Native Assistant Missionaries. In common telescope language of today, it was to be the FIATNAM. It was to be established at Latu, and King George, who we took a little look at the other night in that other lecture, and who loved education and who wanted to support further education, King George provided the materials and the labour to build that first institution. And whenever he visited Hawaii, he went and joined in some of the classes. Although one of the missionaries said, we don't want him to be regarded as a student, but we were happy to see him participating. And so a group of trained teachers was to come forth out of the training institution. And the Reverend Francis Wilson was appointed to do that work, and he did a great work until his premature death in 1846. There are great long reports of the sorrow that accompanied the death of Mr. Wilson, who died relatively young. And after his death, the institution really declined until it was re-established and reinvigorated back here in the Paula in 1847. And that was the forerunner to Tupou College. That was the institution which had two parts to it: a school for children and a school for mainly young men who were to become teachers. And King George wrote that famous letter to Mr. Amos saying, my son's coming down. And he made that amazing statement to his son. Pay attention to the hard and difficult and heavy work that you will come across with Mr. Amos, for it is above every other occupation or activity in importance on earth. And so the institution began, and we could go into a lot of detail about that, but I'm not touching on that, apart from saying that Amos was a trained teacher. He'd been trained in a Scottish form of education. With my Irish origin, perhaps I feel that's the reason why he didn't speak so well. But even with the institution, and even with Richard Amos, a trained teacher, Tupou said to the quarterly meeting in 1848, I want a special teacher for higher education. As we said the other night, when the missionaries couldn't do anything about it, he said to them, well, if the church can't do it, I'll get the government to do it. And that's when the church found they could do it. And the king knew about Malcolm, made an appeal for him, and can I coin that phrase, that is history as far as Malton and Tupou College are concerned. But that was the cradle, the institution. The king looked at it, he was happy enough with it in one way, but he wanted something more. There was something beyond. I've got a report here of one of the, what's the term? Sorry, I'll just move along a bit. I'll just say this. The King's visit to Sydney in 1853 changed a lot of things. He went there to see how Tonga could connect with the big world outside in terms of trade and commerce and culturally. He had an amazing time there. When he was leaving, the church there presented him with a written, what would be called, I think, an illuminated address, praising him for his interest in the welfare of his people. And in response to that, the king made a speech, and these speeches were reported in the local newspapers, Sydney Morning Herald and so on. And among other things, the king said words like this: is it surprising that when someone sees something gracious and wonderful, is it surprising that his heart should dance and his mouth should laugh? And of the little of the printed literature of Tupou that we have, that use of pictures was part of the way he captured the imagination of people. At the 1876 Jubilee, when a great celebration was held here in Nuku'alofa, thousands of people celebrating 50 years of the church. In the speech that day, he ended it with words where he said, why should we not rejoice today? He said, if the leaves of the trees of Tonga and the soil of Tonga had mouths, they would shout the praises of God. When the king came back from Sydney, that marked another key moment in the making of schools. Because what the king discovered in Sydney and reported when he came back was that, quote, in the colonies, adult day schools are not common. That was the excuse then for adults who were being still processed through the school system to say, right, schools are for children. And basically that's what happened. From that point on, the adult schools fell away. And the making of schools concentrated on the children. There's a wonderful report in Robert Young's book. Robert Young was sent from England to come out to the Pacific, to Australia, to New Zealand, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, to report on whether the Methodist Church in the Pacific was able to stand on its own feet. Whether the time had come for the Missionary Committee in London to say, you're free to run your own show in the South Seas. And Robert Young came to the conclusion that that's what ought to happen. Australia, New Zealand, Tonga, and so on. And in his book, he gave a great report of the schools here. One school here in one examination day here in Nuku'alofa. He said that the examination, without a break, ran for 8 hours. 8 hours. The Queen's Church, the King's Church, the institution, the children of the institution, the adult males, the adult females, the young males, the young females, all doing their own particular thing, dressed in Tongan dress, singing, as Robert Young said, wild native airs as they went through the alphabet and the times table. But that was a momentous event, because after that time, and after the King's visit to Sydney, the schools became schools for children. My comments at the beginning of this lecture about a revolution were perhaps a little exaggerated, but given the changes that took place in the short space of 25 years, I think they're justified. I let you do a little more research. There's a massive amount of wonderful stories about how the schools operate. And you can look through some of the windows I've just opened for a moment or two tonight and see a lot more than what I've shown you. But for me, it was a revolution. From a standing start where the language was oral, to the point 25 years later when most of the population could read and write, and the Bible was in their hands and the hymn books with more than 100 hymns in them, and the morning prayer published in 1849, and the sacraments for the burial of the dead services, for baptism, for marriage, prayers. Within a short space of 25 years, a revolution had taken place.
Dr. Cummins. Because the first lecture in Tupou College was very formal, there was no time for questions. We had agreed with Dr. Cummins that after his public lecture tonight, there will be some time for him to answer any questions. So the floor is open for any questions. I'll take 2 or 3 questions before we ask Dr. Cummins to say something. Diana?
I'm just wondering if there are records of similar development of education in other Pacific islands at the time, or even later. Very aware.
I believe that Tonga is unique. More than more than one visitor or commentator would compare. These were people like traders and whalers who travelled around the Pacific. They were amazed at what was happening here in Tonga compared with some other places. And of course, going on beyond the period we're dealing tonight, of course, in Dr. Moulton's time, the production of a whole new massive amount of literature was something that was never equalled anywhere in the Pacific. But for this earlier period, for example, the Sydney Gazette in 1828, when they got the first little printed schoolbook sent over to print, they wrote a major article about the importance of such a thing in the Pacific. Not seen anywhere else in this part of the Pacific. I'm not so sure about Tahiti and Hawaii, but in the Fiji, Tonga, Samoa area, when that handwritten schoolbook arrived in Sydney, the editor of the Sydney Gazette was so impressed he wrote a major article, including, because he'd read the little schoolbook, he indicated how various consonants and vowels were pronounced, informing the people of Sydney what was happening in Tonga. Amazing. So, I'm biased, I know, but I think things happen here in a way that they didn't happen elsewhere. I've got some evidence for that.
Jay, have you ever heard the word coined by Moulton? Palobi Tenisi. It's put in Tonga. Palobi Tenisi. Have you heard that?
Yes, I've heard it, yes. Yes.
He used that for divine providence.
Yes.
Providence. Listening to you. With all those happenings were coincidences or divine providence.
Yes.
Things happen at the right time, in the right place, the right people, or played by God. Divine providence.
Thank you. While you were speaking, I reminded also of the fact that the first hymn that Moulton produced was a translation of Christians Awake. It was a Christian Christmas hymn, but another very, very early one was his version of the hymn Never, Never Give Up. And that kind of enthusiasm was seen in the earlier teachers and so on who went out. Can you imagine what it was like with just a smattering of the language to go and teach others? But they did it with the right sort of heart and the right enthusiasm. So the other thing that Moulton did, this is not about him tonight, I know, but the other thing that he did during his very first week here, he had a little musical instrument, a little harmonium, a kind of organ, and he said that during that first week he played on his harmonium the amazing composition of Handel, the Halloween Chorus. And it's been played ever since. Several times since we've been here, and we're thrilled to bring tears to my eyes when I hear it sung.
Can we be allowed to sing 2 verses of one of his hymns? 391.
391. Of Hawaii have given me.
Oh, Hawaii have given
say to Moimoi please, it brings together the history, the colonial history, and the history of the church here, the little island in the midst of the ocean, blessed and kind, brought by the missionaries. The chiefs and the king converted. Europeans came. Many islands were lost. People put to the test. Only Tonga remains. Fiji, Tahiti lost, Fiji lost, all part of the river. Only Tonga remains. And the last verse, which I found out when I arrived here, the last line, the first line of the last verse is the motto or the theme for the low college. Summers, time to stand up and work. Great thing, one of my plans. Thank you, Jim. Somewhat. Sorry, you get it.
I think when you went to Sophia in 1967, and you were able to compile what I thought at the time was an exhaustive list of common sources of history. How much more did you find in the internet? Apart from the ones that were already
Well, somebody's referring to something that we did at the high school where I produced a thing called Sources of Tongan History, 1616 to 1900, political history. The question is how much more has happened since then. Lots of things have happened since then, so I think Tonga's never been far away from our thinking and acting. And one of the things that we're doing on Wednesday night at a time is to give an outline of what Anne and I are calling sources of Tongan history, language learning, cultural history, language learning and literature, 1616 to 1865. Now we're stopping at 65 because there's another volume that needs to be done which starts at 66 on into the third one. So we've already compiled about 100 pages of extracts from various sources, and one of the things we're doing at Tertiary on Wednesday night is to introduce what we've done, give some examples of what we've done, and then to ask the question, is it worth us, Anna and myself, continuing to complete that work? Is it something that would be useful for at high school level, college, institutional level, to provide again a platform from which people could then move off and move into further research and higher education? So in answer to your question, yes, a lot has happened from then, since those days. Occasionally over the years, I was asked to write an article, a couple of books, wrote a chapter, and then Taufa Howe's letter, which you saw part of there. In 2010, out of the blue, I was asked to do a commentary on that letter, and fortunately, I had a whole lot of missionary records for that very time in the little village where we live in far north New South Wales. So, yes, if there's a positive response at Tertiary on Wednesday night, Anne and I, providing our health, if we maintain, someone said was stay healthy, we will complete that. The question then arises, of course, because we're now in an electronic age, in what form is that done? And we would think possibly some hard copy, but possibly on flash drive or DVD or electronic form.
First, I'd like to thank you very much, Malo, for your great work on Geoffrey Cummins. Now, I was sitting here listening to you and was wondering if this could be some a tiny little window that you can also look at. I know you start from 1826. Wondering, you mentioned Sarah Thomas. Now, I'm wondering if there was any impact or this. What was the wife's contribution to education? Because I'm sure, I mean, wasn't Thomas when he was busy, I'm sure, and he wasn't as educated as Sarah, his wife. So I'm wondering why there hasn't been much mentioned about the wives instead of Sarah's history.
That's a very good question, and Nan and I have been working with as much material as we could find on the role of women. Now, in 1826, the missionary instructions were given to the missionary who was appointed, in that case John Thomas, and he was required to keep a journal, and he was required to write letters back to the committee in London regularly. And fortunately, all Wesleyan missionaries had to do that. The wives were not asked to do that, and so the only opportunity we've got to follow up on the role of women is to try and find examples where their correspondence has been discovered, their letters to their family and so on. Now, in that regard, Mrs. Tucker, there has been a biography of her written, and she was a significant teacher in Mumbai, so that's been written. I think the only hope in published material is to go through the correspondence of the men and see if they mention their wives and what their wives were. I'm sorry to say, that was the prevailing view at the time, that the men wrote the reports and the women, they did a lot of work. So there's a great piece of work to be done there, and I think you'll be able to find quite a bit of resource material, but it might be hidden away in some of the letters and diaries and journals of missionaries when they speak of what their wives may have done. Sometimes there's a few lines, but as far as Mrs. Tucker is concerned, there is a nice little biography of about 150 pages or more about her. Can't think of any others where there's been a published account. So it's where they're waiting, the window has been opened, you've looked through it and you have seen an open door.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed this lecture. Now, my question is about the first lecture.
Yes.
Just from my own understanding, you describe just about the first and Dr. Moulton.
Yes.
And you used the word genius.
Yes. Yes.
You used a lot.
I did.
Now, what is the real meaning of this? And one person really know the Tongan word for it. I try to think of the Tongan.
That was the thing, because a long time ago I read the report of that examination in 1869 when Tupou College was just getting established and people were saying some amazing things at what was happening there. The range of subjects was quite astounding, and people were critical. And so the group from Sydney came over, and the two people who were sent knew the Tongan language. They'd been here for years as missionaries, many years before. And they wrote a glowing report of what they saw. And in their report, apart from saying, oh Malcolm, is there a teacher like this ever before in Tonga? A cyclopedia of accomplishments. And then they added the opinion of an unnamed person there at that examination. When that person, I'd love to know who it was, said, as he looked at what had happened, this is nothing short of the influence of genius. Now, I would want Tongan scholars to grapple with the word genius, because I think it's probably, it might be hard to come to terms with what that means, but it's in the simplest terms, and it's not doing justice to it. For me, it would mean someone who is intelligent, clever, wise, and able. Intelligent, clever, wise, and able. You put them together, you've got an amazing package. I think I would call that genius.
From my perspective, Moses, I think for me, it's the image of Moses. How he uses the Tongan language, our Tongan culture, and use that as his image. For example, I don't know whether there's anybody here who knows our Tongan word, Tongatapu. In one of his hymns, he talks about Bethlehem. Bethlehem, siya tuulta. Nei meheka I ngāwhurua patoa. Peo hei kau hiwa atua, ka nofo mama ni nau kanamo. Bethlehem ko whai so. The second verse, he says, Tu e alo I he korona, tama tau hawa, pakakai e ua. Kamai kran, whae ki mamai, I whae ngai ku ua. Ko toksi o ilo ai he puhina whia tama tau hawa. Ko tumu ia koe Tongan culture. Talking about this usage,
Very special.
it's at the top of Tongan culture. But there was only one Tongatapu in Tongan East, Makamau. And he was the father of Lutau. Then eventually planned for the last Tonga, Lauti Tonga, and eventually to go first to Lutau. But this usage of a Tongan language, it showed me he is a genius, example of a genius.
The genius of being able to place things in their context, define the language.
Talking about Jesus is a Tongatapu.
It's very supreme.
One question. I'm glad to very you described a genius, because
readily translated the topic of Dr. Cummins for the first public lecture. And maybe he will, as Adamai Meka. I had a little translation, but he said that yours is not very good. My translation is kind of a better one. I'm very glad. I think that he will have to revise his own. It slightly bothers me that a physics person is kind of...
Thank you, Matia. He said the one last question is, my name is Keith, I'm a student here in 1976 and I missed to 1978 together with Dr. Ahman here. I have two questions, but she only allowed one, so let's ask my most to me, important question. You know how people share their testimony, how important the good news and the written Bible, the word of God to them, even they want to die and bury together with them. And there are so many testimonies. It reminds me of the greatest Sermon of the Mount. And out of the 9 blessings, the first one, blessed are those who are poor in spirit. And my question is, it seems to me, in those days, without education, people were more poor in spirit. Now there is abundance of Bible, you can have it on your phone, you can hear it on the radio, watch television. The word is here, yet people are dying, hunger for the word. Why?
I have a lecture about that. I mean, that hymn that Geoffrey suggested we sing, which we sang, it has that poor in spirit kind of element in the first verse in a way to me. But the electronic revolution has changed a lot of things. The next day, after the lecture at Tupou College, I received an email from a professor that I have not had any contact with for many years. And he said, I have just read about your lecture at Tupou College. Let's make contact again after all this time. The reason I'm saying that is that your question is a very difficult one to answer, because just about almost every child in Australia has got in their hands a smartphone or some other device like that. So we are in an age now where we have to find ways to communicate the message. What I've been talking about, there was no other, that was just as, I suppose, surprising and just as revolutionary all those years ago as the electronic age is today. So I think the church here and throughout the world has got to find ways to communicate through the internet, through the smartphone, through the electronic media. That's about as far as I can go. And that is happening, of course, already. But your question seems to suggest that the modern electronic age has reduced the spiritual aspect of people's life and understanding, and I think that's probably true. Recovering that is a big question.
Thank you very much. I think we come to the end of the evening. On behalf of everyone here at TTI, Dr. Geoffrey Cummins, I would like to say mahalo people for a wonderful presentation. And we sincerely hope that volume 2 of History of Tongan Sources will be presented again with yourself and will visit us again in the future. So I'm sure Saturday will agree with us. And we look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday. Like Kifi, Moala had said, and your reference earlier in your presentation, that earlier Tongan teachers had, although did not have formal training as such, when they later, of course, they later had this very long acronym that you had in the Latu, Teacher Training Institute of Free Resident something. But before that, you said that the Tongan teachers had love in their hearts and enthusiasm. And I think that's a big challenge for us here in Tonga, education system here in Tonga, for us to have, I think, the right sort of hearts and enthusiasm. And we may be trained, we have training now in formal teacher training, but the question is, do we have the right hearts and do we have the enthusiasm which our predecessors had? And we hope that's something that you will leave with us, challenge us to continue to seek that right heart and enthusiasm for the teaching, so that it does not become a formal academic pathway, but that it becomes a window to meeting of God. And that's for tonight. So, mahalo Peter, and I ask Reverend Latu, one of your former students, to kindly end the night with a word of prayer. Before she says the prayer, there is coffee outside, so those of you who may want to maybe come and meet Mr. Cummins and say a few words to him before he leaves, coffee is available after Sarah says our final remark.
Let's pray. God, our loving Heavenly Father, we thank you for this great opportunity to gather here and hear some of the beautiful stories of our history, which happened here in Tonga, and it started with our church. It is something that we are most grateful for, that Christianity was brought to this country, and it also brought learning and to start reading the Bible. These people, adults, parents, almost everyone came and were taught to read the Bible. We thank you, Lord, for the opportunity, and we believe that's why Tonga has been blessed in so many ways. God, we thank you for Reverend Dr. Geoffrey Cummins sharing with us his expertise, his knowledge in Tongan history, which is a great challenge for us in thinking about ways in which we can improve, especially the quality of learning, but learning about God. Our people have proved that they are capable, and some of them, perhaps we can say, have begun geniuses in different ways. But we need people who have love in their hearts and enthusiasm that will bring a lot of improvement and a lot of help, especially with our young people nowadays. That's why we are most grateful for this presentation that has been shared to us tonight. Thank you, Lord. We ask that you continue to bless Reverend Dr. Cummins and his wife, and also Reverend Sibel Gajai and Helen, and lots of the missionaries who still come to help our country. And we believe, God, that we will still need them in the future. We ask that you bless them, and when they go back, they will continue to work on ways that will help us to improve, not only on engaging in humanist view, but also in the quality of our spiritual life. We ask that you bless everyone who has gathered here, and also the director of the Institute for everything that she has done, for make this presentation tonight a very enjoyable and learning experience for us all. Lord, please be with us in everything we do, and empower us to do everything to glorify your name. We say this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of the Father, and the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.